So this panel I am very excited about next. We have three passionate activists for nuclear energy. We're going to hear their views on current political landscape for nuclear and what strategies and tactics have been most useful in their efforts to promote nuclear energy and what role society members can play in the next stage of that advocacy. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists and then we'll get right to it. So first up, Dr. Chris Keefer. Dr. Keefer is a family physician. Oh, come on up, come on up. I have a seat for you. Dr. Chris Keefer is a family physician, certified in emergency medicine, as well as the president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Canadians for Nuclear Energy is a leading advocacy group formed by scientists, doctors, engineers, energy workers, policy experts, and other citizens who believe that nuclear energy must be part of Canada's path forward on climate change. He's also the proud father of a 4-year-old son. Next, so come on up, Chris. Welcome, Chris. Next up, we have Matthew Przybylowski, who leads the Canadian branch of the North American Young Generation in Nuclear, NAYGN, if you've heard that acronym before. Matthew will be graduating this spring from McMaster University with a degree in engineering physics. He also has experience in the sector with the NAYGN Group and Can-Do Energy. Welcome, Matt. Last but certainly not least, we have Heather Hoff. Heather has joined us all the way from California, where she leads the advocacy group Mothers for Nuclear and works at Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant and is a member of IFPTE Local 20. If you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend you read the New Yorker's profile from February 2021 on Heather's work as an environmentalist and nuclear energy activist. So I want to get started by asking, what's your sense of the bigger picture of nuclear, Heather? You know, it feels like there's been some significant changes in how our industry is perceived over the past several years. What have you noticed globally and in the US, and how do you think that change came about?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello? Okay. Hi. Yeah, I'm Heather from California. I work at Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant. And when I started Mothers for Nuclear about 6 years ago in 2016, it was looking pretty grim for nuclear around the country and around the world. And that's partly why I started the nonprofit Mothers for Nuclear, to try and communicate differently about nuclear energy. Our industry has historically, I think, kind of scared people by talking about how the plants work and talking about radiation and how it will kill you or it won't kill you, depending how much. And I think a lot of our communication strategies have backfired. And so I started Mothers for Nuclear with the goal of preserving existing nuclear, building more, and also innovating to make, with the goal of having more clean energy worldwide. And the shift that I've seen over the last 6 years has been amazing, outstanding. There are so many groups out there now advocating for nuclear energy, including Chris and NAYGN and so many other ones that I've seen different people with different voices coming out and telling their personal stories about why they think it's important. And it's such a great shift to see.
Thank you, Heather. So, Chris, getting a little closer to home, I think that we're seeing some of the dynamics Heather observed play out here. It's even led to some really significant changes in the provincial and even federal energy policy, right here in Ontario and in Canada. What do you think tipped the scales and pushed these governments to act?
I mean, the scales, they sure have tipped. You know, I've been pretty amazed at the progress that's been made just in the last month. I think we're all going to be pretty excited to put our hands together around the life extension and probable refurbishment of Pickering. But that's not all, right? Right, exactly, right? So you know, that was on the provincial level. Obviously, everyone in this room has major issues with the provincial government right now, but that was a very sound decision and one I think that we are, you know, should be here to celebrate and be very proud of. You know, my organization played a big role in that struggle. But as I mentioned just now, over in Darlington, the federal government, which has been quite, I would very safely say they've been quite anti-nuclear up until about a month ago, came out with a $1 billion funding announcement for the SMR project at Darlington. So we're really seeing a sea change, which may make you pause and say, well, is this nuclear advocacy thing even necessary. I mean, it just looks like it's all happening on its own, right? And I've been quoting this economist a lot. He's not an economist I particularly like. He was Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile's favorite economist. Nonetheless, he did say something very interesting. I'm going to butcher the quotation here. But he said, only a crisis, real or imagined, results in change. And the change that, when that crisis hits, the change that occurs depends on the ideas that we're lying around. And so while this whole phenomenon of nuclear advocacy is a bit puzzling, even to myself, I mean, I'm only in this game about 3 or 4 years. I think Heather's probably the OG amongst us here up on this stage. But the crisis has hit, you know, for instance, for Pickering, the IESO said all of a sudden, whoops, actually, we're going to need a lot more electricity to charge the battery electric vehicles and run the electric arc furnaces and all the other reshoring that we need to do. And the ideas that were lying around were put out there by advocates, you know, such as the folks here up on stage. So, you know, right here at home, a lot of really exciting developments. There's a lot more work to be done. You know, in that introduction about Canadians for Nuclear Energy, we don't think that nuclear just needs to play a part in the clean energy transition. It is central to it. And I'll maybe make that case, but I'm not going to stop hogging the microphone and pass it
If you
along.
could pass it over to Matt, because I'd like to bring him in on this. You know, we've seen through public opinion polling for quite a few years now that there's broad acceptance for nuclear energy across all demographics. Younger people are the most supportive of nuclear. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what drives that support, but also your insight on how to harness it so we can get our political leaders to produce tangible results.
Yeah, I guess that question's kind of two parts. So to answer the first aspect, I'm very new to the industry. I only have about 16 months of actual work experience. I'm still in school. Been dragging out my degree a bit, fair enough. But yeah, still just getting in there. So my take is kind of fresh in why I chose to even pursue a degree in engineering physics and focus in nuclear. And it kind of echoes the same sentiment amongst all my colleagues that are graduating as well right now or just recently graduated. And my experience, my story started in high school. And I really like the quote that you're saying, Chris, because in school, we're being taught we are in a crisis. This is an emergency, and we need to do something about it. And they're motivating you to pursue things that change, will instill change. So when I was looking to get into employment or what I want to do with my life, I was looking at the crisis that we're in. And through my own research, I looked into nuclear, and I could see the value and the change that it can instill. And all my friends are the same. We all chose a career path that not only gave us a job security, but had some corporate social responsibility to it. We wanted an industry that echoes our sentiment and our morals. And that's not just me. That is among all the graduating university students nowadays. Everyone has in mind that they want to do something and be a part of something that is making a change. So I think that's where a lot of the support amongst young demographics comes from, because they identify and they do research, and they know that nuclear is bigger than just a job. It's bigger than some of the challenges it might face. They see past that, and they see the opportunity that it has. So that's where that support is coming from, for sure. And how do we now use that fuel to instill political change? Bit of a plug here for North American Young Generation in Nuclear. I'm not sure if everyone's fully aware of what we do, but a lot of it is networking, professional development, getting people their start in their careers, but also public information and outreach. And some of the things that we're doing is we're harnessing that youth demographic, that drive, that passion. We're going to climate action conferences. We just went to SEM, the Global Clean Energy Action Forum, where we're mobilized over 60 members and a bunch of different chapters. We hosted the first ever nuclear innovation showcase at that Global Clean Energy Action Forum when a couple years ago nuclear wasn't even invited. We had over a 300-person reception. That was led by a young demographic. We had local politicians that came. It was in Pittsburgh. And we're echoing that sentiment in Canada as well. We're driving. We're looking to attend these conferences outside of the scope of just the nuclear industry to try and see where we can offer that public information outreach. We're going into local schools. And that shift in the government and the politics has to come from the people and through that public information outreach and sharing our stories. Because like Heather has mentioned, we talked earlier that her message is a very message-driven through story and not just facts and information. And that's what we see amongst the younger demographic, that we are motivated by stories, but also facts.
Might as well. All right, so thanks for that, Matt. So Heather, traditionally nuclear advocates have tried to overwhelm skeptics with facts and figures. What a great segue, right? And we know that facts are correct, but they don't change hearts and minds. So your approach to advocacy is different. It seems you rely more on personal narratives. So obviously you're a smart person who knows their facts and can speak to them just as effectively as anyone else. But can you tell us how you focus your story on a personal narrative?
Yeah, thank you. When I started at Diablo Canyon, I wanted to know all the facts. I was very skeptical about nuclear energy. I kind of went in like as a spy. I'm going to find out what nefarious stuff this company's doing, and I'm going to expose them. So I was like, what about this? What about that? Asking questions like crazy all the time, trying to figure out all the facts. And it took me a long time to start changing my mind about nuclear, about 6 years before I was like, oh, nuclear is pretty amazing. And I think it aligns with my environmental goals and my humanitarian values. It took a really long time to do that. There was no one, out there telling me stories about, why nuclear was important. So I kind of had to figure out that story on my own. And I just found that over time, I've seen a lot of our companies trying to reach out to people by sharing facts, like I mentioned about the power plant or about how things work, and people just kind of like glaze over. Some of us engineers are curious and want to know more. People that love big equipment, some of us are really into that, but a lot of people just kind of want to hear a more personal story, and they're feeling scared about something, and they don't want a company spokesperson to come to them and say, you don't need to worry about that. Nuclear is safe. We're so safe because we have all these different backup equipments, and we have passive cooling and redundancy and separation of trains. We have all this stuff that keeps you safe. Guys with guns, concrete, razor wire. It goes on and on and on. And what happens is people hear that and come away from that conversation feeling a little more nervous. Like, why is it so complicated? And there must be something really dangerous in there if they have to do, so much to protect it. And so I've found that addressing people's fears is a lot more effective if someone can say, it is kind of scary. I agree. I thought that too. And here's what I used to think. I used to be scared of, this ridiculous story. And here's how I found out the truth about it and what questions I asked and what I learned. And it took me a long time to change my mind. And I think seeing someone else change their minds helps people feel more comfortable to change their minds too.
Thanks, Heather. So now, Chris, I'm going to jump back to you here. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about some tactics and strategies? In your view, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well? What do you think we need to do to seal the deal with this Pickering refurbishment, and what it will take to finally get a full-size CANDU build back on the table?
That's a very big question. I wanted to echo some of what Heather was saying and talk a little bit about a kind of influencer theory of change or influencer model. I mean, when I hear those words, I'm not too excited about it because it does sound so shallow. I'm a facts and figures guy. I'm a nerd. And I think a lot of people in this room are nerds based upon, what your professions are, et cetera. And I don't mean to cheapen it, but there is a huge value in that. I mean, again, why do we hold the opinions that we hold? We have a lot of unexamined beliefs and principles. And really that has to do with who we grew up with, who our parents were, whether we were jocks or, some of the other cliques in school, hippies, whatever, right? It's not that we spend time actually pouring through every opinion that we have and establishing is there evidence or not. That's just not the way that human beings operate. And so a huge part, I think, of the change in attitudes towards nuclear are people like Heather who are influencers. And let me explain that a little bit more because I find if I can spend sort of 30 minutes sitting down face to face with just about anybody, I can convince them on nuclear. And that's because of the stories that I carry, that I bring forward, which I think really establish, my values and that I'm a good person, and that I'm driven by, climate change, by air pollution, by, economic development, et cetera. And those are things that appeal to the people that are listening to me. And so for too long, as Heather was saying, there's been such a focus on, again, explaining a lot of details, a lot of graphs. We do have to fight fear, uncertainty, and doubt with facts, and that is challenging because it's a much more direct route. An emotional appeal is much faster. But I think this kind of generation of nuclear advocates that are coming forward are playing a really, really important role. And in terms of kind of what's delivering the goods and what's still to be done, I've had an exciting few weeks. I was just up in Ottawa on what was referred to in Saga as a lobbying spree. I don't have to register as a lobbyist because I do this for the love. My only source of income is OHIP. But it was an advocacy spree, and I got to speak to a lot of politicians, and it was my second or third time up there, speaking with federal, liberal, and conservative caucus members, cabinet ministers, et cetera. And it's very interesting seeing the kind of wind in the messaging and the arguments that we're using starting to be deployed. Hearing the Minister of Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, right, who has been very anti-nuclear. Let's face it, when the German Chancellor came to visit on whether the Germans should be shutting down their nuclear fleet, he said, I want to respect, I'm not going to interfere in German affairs, and besides, these nuclear plants don't actually avoid gas burning. Gas in Germany is used only for heating and industry, which of course was absolute bullshit, and actually stood in contrast to the world's most popular climate activist, Greta Thunberg, who finally said that no, we should be keeping those nuclear plants open because they're starting up new lignite coal plants in Germany, right? So that's kind of where our minister was at, and now a month later, we have that same Minister Wilkinson at the IAEA ministerial extolling the virtues of nuclear energy. And frankly, some of the talking points that Canadians for Nuclear Energy have put out there are starting to be echoed and coming out of NRCan, Natural Resource Canada. I did this little back of the envelope calculation back when we were fighting for nuclear's inclusion in the green bond. And I was just thinking to myself, we're a major uranium exporter. How much emissions does our uranium output offset every year? How does that compare to our national emissions? How does it compare to like the oil sands? And the answer was pretty remarkable because we're not even mining that much right now. That industry is pretty dormant. But even as it is, based on 2019 stats, the facts are incredible. We offset fully 1/3 of Canada's total all-sector national emissions with the uranium that is used domestically and internationally from Canada. The oil sands puts 80 megatons of CO2 in the atmosphere. The uranium mining that we do offsets 300 megatons, right? And our total national emissions are about 730 megatons. So 1/3. And this is all sort of carbon accounting. Like, one should be skeptical of that. Carbon in the air is carbon in the air. But we would be burning a lot more gas and coal if it wasn't for that contribution. And to see Natural Resource Canada tweeting about that now, that is a major triumph. So when I talk about, the ideas that are lying around being so important, they really are. I've been asked before, in terms of how this, going to Ottawa and going to the provincial legislature, you learn a lot about how the political sausage gets made. And it's ugly, clearly, right? It's a lot of backdoor deals, influence peddling, a lot of people in positions of power cycling into the industry that they may have been favoring while in power. That kind of stuff is happening all the time. And so there's this kind of idea of patronage relationships, right? And who is the patron of nuclear? If we're just talking in crass terms about how the political sausage gets made, I mean, there are powerful natural gas interests, for instance, that fight for natural gas. There are powerful environmental group interests that fight for wind and solar deployment, for instance. But who is the kind of political bloc or the advocates for nuclear? Nuclear tends to be owned by utilities who often operate other assets. There's no special loyalty there. They're chasing, the best economics. We've certainly seen that with a lot of plant closures in the States occur. And when I sort of started a grassroots civil society pro-nuclear organization, I looked around and I said, who's going to be able to fight for this technology, which I think is so important in delivering effective climate action and some of the other important deliverables that it has. And I saw that there were 76,000 people working directly in nuclear right in Ontario. And so in terms of what's going to deliver the goods, How are we going to get Pickering locked in? It's very much through mobilizing this very strategic, frankly, it's a voting bloc. And some of the actions that we've taken, like the House of Commons petitions, we did one on including nuclear within the Green Bond. We got over 10,000 signatures on that petition. It was the second most signed petition in the economics and finance category of this 44th parliamentary session. That was you guys, right? My organization, this was a big thing, is we need to activate this base. I know you guys are doing a lot on your own. Don't let me, I'm not trying to sound arrogant that I parachuted in and this happened, but there are ways, I think, through email lists with unions, with the various companies, with everybody else, to really mobilize the sector and become much more politically powerful. Of course, the other grand patron of nuclear is just physics, right? The challenge of climate change is not just to produce clean energy, it's to replace fossil fuel services, right? And we know that wind and solar are critically limited in their ability to do so because they're not dispatchable. I mean, I think you guys all understand these arguments. And nuclear is, and that's how, in Ontario, for instance, we phased out coal, right? Nuclear can provide the fossil fuel service of being dispatchable, available, always on, and so was able to accomplish that. And I think there's a lot to be proud of in that accomplishment and carrying these stories forward. So, in terms of the nitty-gritty of how to move from this life extension to a refurbishment, we certainly need to be active. There's things like the CNSC licensing hearings. But some of the actions that my organization are planning are to go to municipal councils. We know that our friends, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, have been very successful going to municipal councils and making presentations, and they actually got the IESO to model a whole gas phase-out study based upon that activism. These are horribly misguided people who wanted to replace coal with natural gas, right? The Ontario Green Air Alliance, one would call them. They're opposed to the life extension or refurbishment of Pickering, but of course, luckily, Asthma Canada's on our side in terms of who's got more clean air credibility. So again, my modus operandi is to respect on the antis because they've got a lot of years in this. They've done a lot of organizing. They've got good ground game, good fundraising, good door knocking skills, and we need to lift and borrow their tactics, right, and put in our messaging. And our messaging in the end is the correct messaging, and I think that's a big part of how we win. So again, just as one example of that, the Green Bond House of Commons petition was that. Sierra Club had an anti-nuclear petition out. I said, what the hell is this House of Commons thing? You get 500 signatures and a sponsoring MP, and you can have your petition read on the floor of the House of Commons, and the government has to do a written response? Cool, let's do that. And so, again, I'll cut myself off in just a second, but as one concrete thing we can do, our organization plans on making presentations at municipal councils, borrowing that Ontario Green Air Alliance strategy and employing it for good, right? And it's going to be really important because we know in previous, the Pickering life extension in 2018, there was a lot of fear-mongering that these anti-nuclear organizations did at councils. I think particularly Scarborough was one that got a bit heated. So we need to be really on it. There's still a lot for nuclear advocates to do. Certainly it's wonderful to feel the wind in our sails for once, but we have to carpe diem on this moment. That was a very rambling
That was
answer.
awesome though. Thank you. Thanks, exactly. Yeah. So Matt, as a leader in the Canadian Nuclear Advocacy, who mobilizes students and younger workers, how do you think frontline society members can contribute to increasing Canada's nuclear fleet?
Yeah, thank you for that one. I mean, when we're thinking about nuclear in Canada, we're thinking about growing the fleet. And that is a huge task. Like, how big of a task for Chris when you led the to get Pickering extended? That was a huge task, a monumental feat. So now we're not just thinking about saving nuclear plants, we're thinking about growing and expanding. And if we look, I'm going to answer this in kind of twofold. I think there's two things that can be done. One thing is we need a massive influx of workers to be able to fuel that expansion. Right now, we struggle even with skilled labor jobs. We can't recruit enough. And that's across multiple different industries. It's not exclusive to nuclear. But if we want to expand our nuclear fleet, We need to start growing talent now. A lot of these timelines are 10, 15 years in the future. So that means kids nowadays that are going to be growing up, choosing their career paths and what they want to do. So I think one of the things is that knowledge transfer aspect. I was recruited in high school through my own research, but not everyone will be as ambitious to do that own research. So I think wherever you can as a society member, you have to be ready to mentor and grow talent. You are a steward for the industry, and you can utilize your skills to be that mentor to a new young face, to grow that talent pool. And then another aspect I think that's really important is going off that steward aspect. No matter whether you like it or not, as a nuclear industry worker, you are looked at as maybe an expert within your local communities and groups and social circles. It goes into that kind of influencer model that Chris is talking about. You work in the industry, now you know the information, and you're expected to know all the information. And sometimes you don't, and that's okay. But you need to be prepared to talk about the challenging topics and discussions that you might face. I know myself, I took a little break from my co-ops over the summer. I went tree planting out west in BC, and in my group, it was a 60-person camp, and obviously you get to know each other quite well. They ask what you're doing, and I told them I was working in nuclear power, or I want to be working in nuclear power, and a lot of the people are out west from BC, a very different perspective on it. It's mostly hydro out there. They have a ban on nuclear, I'm pretty sure, still provincially, and people were asking me questions, a lot of questions. And I was ready to answer those, because a lot of the times when you think about advocacy, you're not trying to change someone that is super against it all the way to be a hardcore supporter and advocate. Every discussion you have to go into thinking about, if it's a scale, 0 is 0 support to 10 is you're the hardcore advocate, think about every discussion as being you're trying to move that dial maybe half or 1 point. You're not trying to change someone's perspective and opinions in that one discussion. You're just trying to influence it slightly and incrementally. Heather, you talked about like how you were working and discussing and questioning for years when you were in your job, and it took many years before you were at the point that you're at now. And I think that story echoes amongst many other people. It's not going to be one discussion that changes things. It's going to be many incremental discussions and opinions and debates, really. It sounds like a daunting task, but just going back to that aspect of sharing a story is very impactful. You don't need to have all the facts and all the information about every scary topic that there might be when it encounters nuclear. People appreciate truth and honesty. If you don't know a question, you can say you don't know, and people respect that. But you can follow up. What changes that discussion is you follow up with them after, once you do find out. Stuff like that. Changing that perspective incrementally is really key, and I think everyone can do that. As an industry, and when you work in the industry, you are well suited to be that go-to person. I was sitting with my project colleague in my capstone group, and we were in the lab working on our capstone group, and he got a phone call from his friend's dad, or his dad's friend, sorry, who just called him up. He's a hunting buddy, and he's like, "Hey, Luke, what are you doing right now?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm just working on a project." He's like, "Yeah, me and my pals, we're all just drinking by the fire right now, and we're talking about nuclear. Can you share your thoughts?" And over the phone, he just talked to a group of people that were just curious about it. And by the end of the conversation, they were like, "Oh, wow, that's really, really cool," just because it was in the news and they were wondering about it, and they knew that he was the person that might know some answers to things. And like, if you think about how that impacts everyone else, go and talk to 60 people in your life about nuclear, they change their perspective slightly and they talk to other people about it. And that's how we're going to instill change. That's how we're going to grow and attract new talent. And then that's also how we're going to expand and get the public support needed to be able to increase our nuclear fleet.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, I agree. Just looking at my watch and looking at the time, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. But I want to thank you so much for your deep insight on how we can be better advocates and change the future for nuclear energy. So let's keep in touch as we move forward and keep moving that dial and keep, half point, 1 point, you know, the conversations and the virtual fireside chat, you know, like we can all play that role that Matt just talked about, right? Talk to someone who doesn't know about nuclear and move them a half, move them one. And again, like you said, if you don't know, you don't know, but figure it out and follow up, because that's genuine, you know, that's true, genuine advocacy, because you're helping them understand something a little bit better. And as people understand, they're more willing to take action. So, with that said, I'd like to thank you all again for coming. It was a great chat, and I'll call upon Lori to come up and introduce our next speaker. So thank you, a big round of applause.